Kia ora everyone, and welcome into my chorus for April the 1st. It is a Wednesday, and it's a day for 6 bits of news in our political economy, because the kaka is all about housing, climate and poverty in our political economy. Firstly, there is going to be a cabinet reshuffle tomorrow with the departure of Judith Collins and Paul Goldsmith. Christopher Luxon needs to do a reshuffle, and this has coincided with a whole bunch of new leadership talk. That's because there were a group of meetings in Auckland on Sunday involving various National Party MPs and national ministers, which they say were normal practice, but which the chatter around the press gallery in Wellington suggests was more than normal. This is after another poll showing National well below 30%, and we'll talk about that in a second. Overnight, Donald Trump has told his allies that they can go and get their own oil. Now, we've seen a rise in stock markets. However, this is largely because America is quite happy that Trump is talking about de-escalation in Iran. However, Trump is talking about de-escalation and not bothering to stop to reopen the Strait of Hormuz first. He's saying, well, I've got other things on. If anyone wants to open the Strait of Hormuz, they can do it. The Europeans and the Asians, go get your own oil, was his comment in a Truth Social post. So we've actually seen the oil price rise again in the last hour or two, up to $118 US for Brent crude. Now, remember, of course, that you layer on top of that various crack spreads and margins to get the price here in Aotearoa. Now, the other big news, I think, in the housing political economy is the announcements yesterday and a release of legislation showing that Chris Bishop has again cut the housing capacity for Auckland. You might recall a few weeks ago, he capitulated to the complaints of National Party MPs in the leafy suburbs and cut the capacity from 2 million to 1.6 million. Well, there's another cut yesterday, down to 1.4 million in the details. It looks like, though, many of those cuts are on the fringes rather than in the centre, with the removal of floodplains from some of the areas that could be developed, and also a tightening of the circle of 10 to 10 kilometres around the centre of the CBD, which is good from an anti-sprawl point of view. But again, when you've got a city with 1.2 million homes and very quickly headed for a couple of million people, won't be long before we'll run out. Also, we'll talk a bit more about what's happening with business confidence, the results of a survey out yesterday, and a couple of bits and pieces this morning in the media, various scoops and charts, and an interesting map or two. Alrighty, let's move on now to this first story. Christopher Luxon, again, is in trouble, according to the chatter around the press gallery. He's having to do a reshuffle tomorrow, so he'll have to be very careful about how he does that, because it will include, it seems, taking a ministerial job off Chris Bishop. Although Chris Bishop's pretty heavily loaded down, Bishop is still important in the caucus, albeit after alienating a bunch of national MPs by trying to increase the supply of housing and reduce house prices. And we'll see how that plays out in the next couple of days. It looks like it's tomorrow we'll get that announcement. And this is because we've seen various bits of speculation yesterday out of Henry Cook, Thomas Coughlin, and referred to today by Joe Moyer from RNZ about various meetings involving MPs and ministers in Auckland on Sunday. And ahead of the cabinet meeting, and we'll see what crops up in tomorrow's news conference. Because we have a fresh opinion poll out. The Roy Morgan poll came out last night. It's interesting. It doesn't get a lot of coverage in other media, often because they've got their own polls to promote, but it is a long-running poll, and certainly it's useful because it's done in conjunction with consumer confidence. And what it shows you is that in the last month, remember this is one of the first ones for March, it shows that national support has dropped from 34.5% to 26.5% in the last 2 months, and is down from 31 to 26.5 in the last month. And that is a substantial difference. So we've now got Labor ahead of National by 8.5 points in the Roy Morgan poll. Interestingly, too, that New Zealand First up to match Greens for the first time in the Roy Morgan poll. And that is a sign that something is going on through this month, and not necessarily in a good way for the government. However, because the Greens and the Māori Party are not really moving ahead as well, we still don't see the opposition pulling away from the government. So basically, it's still neck and neck. And with the rise of New Zealand First, that is helping to keep the government even Stevens with the opposition at the moment. I think it's worth diving into the numbers a bit to find out who exactly supports the government and who's in favour of the opposition. One of the great things about the Roy Morgan poll is that it does the demographics and releases them every time. And what you can see here is that young women are not a fan of National, and currently only 13.5% support young women support National, when the number for the wider population is 26.5%. And you can see that the number of older women who support National is close to 3 times higher in terms of percentage terms, and actually higher than the overall number. 50-plus men are the highest supporters of National, and certainly of ACT and New Zealand First. And overall, 50-plus men are 70.5% in favour of the current coalition, whereas young women, significantly less than half the relative support for the government. Interestingly, though, young women are not big supporters of the Greens, 11.5%, which is about in line with where the overall population is. And actually, it's young men who support the Greens more than young women. Interesting too that young women are more focused on Labour and Te Pāti Māori. Support amongst young women for Te Pāti Māori is at 3 times the level of the overall population. Not mentioned in this chart, but according to Roy Morgan, the Opportunity Party is up at 4%, again stable there. Now, the other thing to look at, I think, and I always try and keep an eye on it, is the relationship between consumer confidence and government confidence. So this is asking the question, right track, wrong track, and there's been a sharp slump in the public's view on whether the country's on the right track or wrong track, and it's often quite closely aligned, or at least correlated, with what's happening with consumer confidence. Interestingly, consumer confidence is very closely correlated with the petrol price. So if you want to know how popular the government is, just have a look at the petrol price. And of course, that is rising fast. So it's an inverted correlation there. Okay, what else is happening tonight? I mean, I try not to pass on what Trump says regularly, because otherwise you'd drive you nuts. But this one this morning is tells us a lot about where Trump's head is at. He wants to get out of the Middle East. He realised he stuffed it up. The trouble is he can't really taco, or Trump always chickens out, because the Iranians have blocked the Strait of Hormuz. Now, Trump thinks that, well, it doesn't matter. The United States doesn't need oil from the Strait of Hormuz, and technically that's true, but of course it is a global market. And so the price of gas, as the Americans call it, petrol, we'd call it, rose above $4 a gallon. That's much cheaper than us because they don't have taxes on their gas. But $4 a gallon is an interesting milestone. It's similar, you could argue, to $4 a litre here, which we'll get to in the not too distant future. And what Trump is saying here is that, well, I've had enough of this stuff in Iran. I'm getting out. I don't necessarily need to open the Strait of Hormuz. That's up to you. And he's saying to the Brits and the Europeans and the Asians, okay, if you want your oil, you come buy it from us. Well, that'll just push the price up. But anyway, and you need to get your courage back. This is from a man who avoided service in Vietnam by saying he had bone spurs, and that they should go and take the oil and reopen the strait themselves. Now, the markets initially quite liked the idea of de-escalation by the United States, but it's clear now Trump is not necessarily committed to reopening the Strait of Hormuz. That is a problem for everyone. We'll see. He could just as easily say something different tomorrow night. Now, let's have a look at what's happening in housing intensification, or not so much intensification. Remember the big picture here. Chris Bishop is the guy who wants to bring down house prices relative to incomes and rents relative to incomes with a housing supply surge. His way of doing it is to foster intensification. I support that, and I hope others do too. Started out with 2 million as the potential capacity for the Auckland housing population, if you like, or potential capacity. There was a revolt from the backbenchers of national, and actually some front bench national MPs as well, along with, of course, the Conservative councillors, some of whom have been, or at least one of, there's a couple of former national cabinet ministers in there. And that has seen it dropped initially to 1.6 million about a month ago. But yesterday we got details in the legislation through from Chris Bishop down to 1.4 million. That's up from 1.2 million under the current unitary plan. And this is all about Plan Change 120. So there's a couple of details in there. It looks like flood areas have been downzoned. I'm not so interested in having houses in flood zones. That's good. Restricting the amount of development to inside a 10-kilometre radius around the CBD. That's good. But again, this is all about the NIMBY boomer backlash MPs ganging up on Chris Bishop and pushing him back into his box. Because, remember, we are a housing market with bets tacked on, and anything that threatens house price inflation or even suggests house price deflation is anathema. We can't handle it. And this is the leafy suburbs expressing their political will through the National Party's electorate MPs, particularly in Auckland. This tells us that New Zealand's economy is a housing market with bets tacked on, and we can't handle the truth of what happens when house prices fall, or even a minister suggests that he'd quite like them to fall. Right, let's have a look at business confidence. We've got the first numbers through yesterday from the ANZ Business Outlook survey for March. It goes out in two batches. Firstly, there's a request for business opinion in the first week of March, and then another one last week, so the third week of March. And you can see there a sharp drop in overall business confidence. That's the blue line, which asks the question, how do you feel about the broader economy? The black line there is, how's your activity in March versus a year ago? And that's actually a much more useful measure of what's going on. The red line is, how's the activity in your own business looking over the next year? That's also fallen. There was a time when those two things were together. But typically, when nationals in power, people in business think the wider economy is doing better than their own businesses. And when you see Labor in power, you don't see the same view about the wider economy. So that's what I call the delusion gap there, where the activity outlook, the red line and the blue line are together, and the black line is an interesting problem as well. That says that actual activity doesn't catch up with expectations of own activity. This says that New Zealand businesses are suddenly very concerned about the future, and of course it's connected to petrol prices. Now, it's worth looking at the responses at the different times in the survey. You can see there the blue line is what happened when the first request went out from ANZ. So there was a little bit of confidence in that first week in March. People thought, oh, this oil problem won't last long. By the third week of March, oh, we're really worried now. And you can see that, interestingly, own activity is still expected to be better. But when you look at past activity, so what's actually happening with, new orders, employment, investment, that sort of thing, it was actually past employment. So even at the beginning of the month, people were hiring less. And by the end of the month, they're hiring even less. So this is a bad sign for business confidence, as you'd expect. Now, to give you an idea on inflation and what people are planning to do with their own prices and also their own wages, you can see there that prices, people expecting to increase their prices towards the end of the month, in the year ahead or the next 3 months. But wages, currently they're expected to just on 70-something% are expecting to increase their wages. And you can see there that wage expectations over the next 3 months or so are not rising as fast as our price expectations. So there we have businesses expecting real falls in wages. And just to sort of highlight what particular sectors are hurting the most, retail, as you'd expect, construction, and of course a north-south divide continuing, with the South Island really struggling for employment, although the North Island struggling and the South Island are doing significantly better. Okay, the scoop to look out for today comes from Phil Pennington, finding out from an OAA that Health NZ is not spending as much as it promised it would on capital expenditure, which Simeon Brown's not happy with. This is partly because he sacked a bunch of the back office planners and the likes earlier in his reign, and that is now coming back to bite him. It's biting the government too, because of course less infrastructure spend in hospitals is hurting the government. I thought I'd highlight this chart that came out of One News yesterday, which I think is an interesting problem with, of course, health, poverty, and a regulatory failure. Imports of nitrous oxide, also called NANGs, over the last 5 years or so, explosive growth, quintupled in 5 years, up nearly 70% in the last year. These, of course, are these cartridges, which in theory are supposed to be used to squirt cream onto food. But something else is going on here, of course, and it's one of these things that you'd think would be dealt with in quick fashion as a clear failure, and of course a health issue. Now, I wanted to put this chart up here as well, and I'll put a more detailed version in the email newsletter that goes out with the recording of this chorus. This is a chart that's doing the rounds from JP Morgan using data from Kepler, which has worked out the timeframes for the shipments of oil going through the Middle East and then headed to various parts of the world. And what it tells us is how much oil is going to various places and how long it takes. So this suggests that the last deliveries from the Middle East will end today into China, South Korea, Japan, and Singapore, where, of course, our fuel is refined. And then there's another sort of 20 days or so before the last deliveries get to Australia and New Zealand. So that gives us an interesting sort of deadline day to say, April the 20th is D-Day for us. Now, the last known departure of a tanker for New Zealand left day before yesterday, and it's due to arrive on the 11th of April. So we may get a few more through until the 20th, and that's when the rubber hits the road of whether or not we run out, 30 or 40 days later. So currently my estimate is that we are in trouble. If we get no more tankers after April the 11th, we are in trouble towards the end of May, so around budget time. Interestingly, one of the reasons the business confidence is tanking is that it's very clear the government's not going to provide any subsidies to help take the pain away, unlike in Australia and most other countries where they are essentially using the Crown's balance sheet or the government's balance sheet to soften the blow because government balance sheets are in healthier states than households. Here, the government's decided that the household sector and business sector will take the hit, not the government. And that's obviously hurting confidence in the business sector, increasing calls, for example, from the transport sector, the truckers for some road user charges relief. And yesterday, Nicola Willis outright rejected that and again did the same again in her interview on RNZ. So that's a bit of pain there for the business sector. And some breaking news today. This is awful for Northland. It looks like the Jukin mills in Kaitaia, two of them, these are timber mills, look like they're going to shut down. That's a couple of hundred workers and one of the major employers in Kaitaia already, a really tough place. And that is really bad news. Secondly, interesting research that Kate Green has highlighted for RNZ on a steep rise in sepsis admissions into hospitals over the last 20 years. Essentially, these are illnesses and admissions due to poverty, and they are up significantly over the last 20 years, 73% in fact. So again, another symptom of our problems with poverty and health. So the scoops today in the various papers and what we've got out of the newspapers. So we've got an issue there with press. Here we go, the front pages. So the Herald's chosen to lead with the David Tamahiri decision. Post has got a rise in directors' fees for fire and emergency New Zealand, and housing market with bits tacked on. The press leads with Carter's selling 1,000 sections in Rolleston. And here's our cartoon of the day, another cracker from Sharon Murdoch on our food security issues. There we go. There are my 6 things in a chorus for Wednesday, April the 1st. Ka kite anō.